In this session, we're going to take a look at business models, the different components, financial, governance, and technical. I'll present a little bit of context, and then Anna, Michael, and Jong will each present a typical case study, and they'll cover the journey taken by each system, the lessons learned, and provide some insights. There are about 12 cases in the report. We're just going to be covering a few to give you a brief idea. I want to start off by saying, I think it was Bruce that mentioned earlier in the day that there's no one business model that's perfect. It's a matter of choosing which business model fits your system and its needs. And we've outlined a few critical steps for choosing business models, starting with objectives. We find that every system is different. It may be technically quite similar in that we have, district energy generation assets and pipes, but really the objectives can vary from modernization of an aging set of government buildings in Ottawa, as Thomas was talking about, to greenhouse gas reduction goals in Paris, to economic development. So the objectives are key. We have to get all the stakeholders at the same table, get them to collectively buy into the objectives, and really identify the why we're going to be doing this system and put up with the painful journey that awaits us. So the second criteria that we have to look at is risk, because carrying risk has a price. The party that carries the risk will require that they get paid for that. And so not identifying risk sets up a path for failure. Right at the outset, you need to identify risk because it will affect developers. It'll affect customers because if the system is delayed, they can't go into the building and start using the system. It, of course, affects investors and lenders, and they'll charge a price for that. So risk mitigation involves understanding, identifying the risk, and assigning it to the right party. And of course, with the price that goes along with it. And last but not least, all these systems require money and funding. And what we have found is the funding that you need at the concept stage is not quite the funding you need when you're modernizing 80 buildings and trying to revamp a steam system to hot water. That comes with a different price tag. So let's leverage the right source of funding. Many systems have leveraged grants and government feasibility and pre-screening funds, as Eric Moe is very familiar with. And these funds are very important to start seeding the project and starting the conversations that need to happen among the stakeholders. We talked about understanding risk. I think this is a very important area that, if not attended to, will come back to bite you. And you don't know when it'll bite you, and you won't be able to handle the impact of the risk. So in terms of understanding risk, we have identified in the report many different types of risk. I encourage you to go read up their examples. There are best practices that will help you get through these. So very quickly, in the interest of time, we talked about objective risks. Design risks, if the system is not designed correctly, if you oversize it, you're going to invest more capital. If it's not designed correctly, pressures, temperatures, delta T's, as Juan will tell you, you lose a lot of money in the OpEx part of your budget, and it can be a life cycle cost impact. Construction risk, this can happen because, there are unforeseen circumstances in the piping layouts and routes. Procurement risk can be high, especially when it's city procurement versus private procurement. We talked about demand risk earlier in the day. We need to make sure that the buildings that we have assumed will connect to our system will actually end up signing contracts. We also need to make sure that they don't leave the system while the system is operational, because all this changes the assumptions on demand. And for established systems, you'll find that sometimes the payments are not coming in as expected for whatever reasons. Either rate is unsustainable or there are fuel poverty issues. So all of these risks compound system risk. And so I think we mentioned operational risk, this commercial risk, in balancing the payments with the cost of service. Vancouver did that by post-loading their fixed costs. That has a risk as well, as they're probably finding out now that these reserve funds will eventually deplete and you have to start charging out the price of the cost of service. And return on investment. Investors have expectations. Private capital expects often 20–30% return, whereas public capital can be made happy with 7 to 8%. So all of these investors need to come to the table with an understanding of what it is they're going to be party to. Where in the report we have covered the whole spectrum of business models. Michael King from the UK has been looking at this for a long, long time, and we call this the spectrum, which goes from the wholly public to the wholly private, and in between we have a hybrid public-private partnership type business models, each with their own set of pros and cons. So what business model is best for your project? What approaches will work for you? Is it going it alone as a public entity or a private entity, or does a partnership make sense at this stage of the project? It all comes down to objectives, constraints, and trade-offs. So control over your objectives can be easily lost, as Tomas was saying. You will probably have to forego expansion, or where you want to expand, or what new technologies you may need to bring in over the life of the system. So who bears the risk and whose money you will be using will determine the business model, if you will, over the life cycle. This chart just shows a spectrum and trades off control, risk, and finance. In the report, we have a chart that shows the trade-offs, again, for the wholly public to the wholly private. It describes who's bearing the risk and what the impact is. For example, in the entirely public sector led project where they own it, fund it, operate it, maintain it, they retain all the risk. They have to make sure that they recover their cost of service, that their buildings operate as expected, their systems are right-sized, and so on. And procurement can be tedious with public sector entities. These are all characteristics of a wholly public enterprise. But at the same time, you have a lot of control. You, the city, can look at multiple objectives: fuel poverty, emissions reduction, smart buildings. As Tomas was mentioning, what type of fuel, as Michael was mentioning, moving to future fuels, if you will, hydrogen if it comes eventually. So what the city can also offer is land, planning skills, and early transfer. Early screening of projects, and also work with developers. How do we encourage developers to connect to our systems? So the public spectrum of models, we have identified 3 different variations on this theme. Internal department really is the city. The municipality owns it. It could be a public works department, or a department that is created just to oversee the district energy system. Public funds are used, and the government acts as the governing body. In the social case, this is common in Europe, a community owns the system which the municipality establishes, and it owns it as a not-for-profit cooperative. Anna will talk more about this later in the day. And the owners do select board members, so governance is retained in the community-owned group. Special purpose vehicles are, they're created for the special purpose of running the district energy system, and they are independent from the public entity. And it's for a good reason, because there can be conflicts of interest, and the financial part has to be controlled as well. And some of these special purpose entities can be established as limited by guarantee based on shares. What that means is the partners in the SPV identify what, based on their shares, what amount of liability they are willing to bear if the company goes under. So it's as you can see, all of these models do require some contractual legal documents, memorandum of understanding, but they've been done and they've been used across the globe. Coming to hybrids, the concession, I think we're hearing a lot about concessions. Paris is one of the long-standing concessions that, and as Thomas showed us, you know, they maintain, ClaimSpace maintains this enormous system that uses the River Seine as is a heat sink. The pipes are all going through the sewer systems, and yet maintains to cool iconic buildings like the Louvre. And you know, it's just an amazing story of what can be done, and it's waste to energy. So when a city like Paris decides it wants to do something and can make it happen, and one of the reasons they wanted to do this is they didn't want cooling towers on top of their iconic buildings. So the objective was aesthetics, but here we are with an amazing system. There are other examples. Most recently, in the US, University of Oklahoma, I know there were people from Corix earlier on in the corridor that I saw that, there you are. So what was interesting to us is here's a public sector college campus, University of Oklahoma, very large. They found themselves in the need for modernization and improving their system, and they put out bids to private sector folks to see if they would like to have a concession to operate and maintain their assets. And Corix was the winner of that bid, and they, I think it was 2007 or 10, I'm not sure, but they now are the concessionaire for the University of Oklahoma, but the governance remains with the University of Oklahoma, and the rates, which we talked about early in the morning, the cost of service model is run every year. The rates are determined by Corix, but then the university has a third party review that to make sure that these rate increases, particularly, are substantiated by true costs. But by having that model, they can control the growth of their campus, where they want to connect the next building, what fuels they want to use. So it's sort of a win-win for University of Oklahoma. Joint venture, we have some examples of that. Basically, joint venture is, again, a limited company with partners joining together in this venture for creating district energy. And each partner brings a different set of competencies and skills, and that's what makes the joint venture stronger than just going it alone. We talked about special purpose vehicles. Again, these can be designed. They're wholly owned subsidiaries, and they would require that you put together the right contractual documents. I want to talk a little bit about this very innovative business model that we're seeing, particularly with data centers that are connected to district energy systems. This one is an example from Stockholm. Stockholm, again, is green cooling. They use the Baltic Sea for their district cooling system. And the Finnish company Fortum Varme provides cooling to this data center in the middle of Stockholm. It's in a World War II bunker. You should look up this data center. It's a World War II bunker, and I believe some of the WikiLeaks servers are housed in this building. But it's a fascinating, to your point about what a data center should be, not just a box. This is an amazing data center. But what they've come up with is a prosumer model where the data center as consumer has worked with Fortum Varme to take the heat that the servers generate, capture that heat, and through heat pumps send it back into the district heating system. So the data center actually gets paid for this waste heat that they're pumping back. Now, all of this is possible because there are district energy systems in the neighborhood. So there is a platform and a vehicle for us to move into newer models. On the electric side, with microgrids, we're exploring some of these models, but on the thermal side, there's some interesting business models that are happening. On the private side, I'll be brief. Michael's going to talk about WIC Scotland. This is self-explanatory. There's a private sector, say NRG in Phoenix. They own their assets, they maintain, they operate. They're responsible for metering and billing and all of it's entailed. And they do their own financing. They have to procure either debt or put in their own money. And it's at a higher price, so the rates would definitely affect the system customer rates. But at the same time, as Bruce was saying earlier in the day, they provide a premium service to downtown Phoenix buildings, the Diamondback Stadium. It also avoids, the Diamondbacks don't have to put in chillers that need to run for 80 days in the year when they have ball games. They let Jim Lodge worry about that and provide cooling through his assets. And Jim can, cool the courthouse and other buildings because he now has capacity that was originally, like in Markham, to serve IBM, was the Diamondbacks as an anchor tenant. So there are a lot of, Suresh Jambunathan is here from Veolia. We have Corix. We have a lot of folks who are very experienced in the private sector in running these systems. Our report has a few pages of strengths and weaknesses. I'd suggest that they're very reflective of the trade-offs we're talking about. There's no holy grail, no silver bullet. You have to make the trade-offs. We have covered the whole spectrum of business models. And the last point I want to make is our systems live in communities. They are growing, connecting, growing networks. So just as the system grows, the business models also change. We have examples of our 12 cases, and the bullets show that they start off as one business model, but over time they've migrated to be something else. Enwave is another example where they got acquired by a public entity called Brookfield. So the thing to remember is things are dynamic. As I was telling Bruce earlier, district energy is an art as much as it is a science. You have to really make the trade-offs, paint the picture that your system requires, and then, of course, be passionate and persuade and educate your constituents as to the value proposition that this system will bring to your community. So with that, I would like to invite our presenters for our 3 business cases. Anna Chittum will talk about Aarhus. Jong will come back up and talk about Sangam, and then Michael will talk about WIC.
We're all going to just kind of briefly go through some of the more interesting aspects of a few of the particular cases that reflect a number of the different business models that Lakshmi was just talking about. So I'm going to be talking about Aarhus, Denmark, which is the 2nd biggest city in Denmark after Copenhagen, population of about 315,000. And the system there the district heating system has been in place for some time, but there have been some new developments and new investments that I think are worthy of conversation. So it's a pretty big system. It's serving essentially the whole city. I think it's actually not quite 100%. I think it's about 95% of the city. But there are a lot of different waste resources that are going into that system, which is pretty typical throughout Denmark that I have seen at least. So there's waste incineration, there's coal, there's oil, there's some biomass, and the heat that is circulated as hot water is primarily for space heating and domestic water heating. So this is a picture of one of the CHP plants, the Studstrup power plant, which is owned by Jong Energy, which is, for all intents and purposes, essentially a private owner. of a plant. And so this is one of the entities that is providing heat to the Aarhus system. It had been burning just coal and oil, and so we'll talk about a conversion to biomass and how that benefited the Aarhus system. So what happened is that the city of Aarhus essentially wanted to have renewable heating resources, and the national goals and again the EU goals, those were all sort of driving consideration of looking at sort of what are the available renewable resources that are out there, the low carbon resources. And sorry, lessons learned has come rather early. I think the slides got mixed around a little bit, but so the city had to determine, how are we going to encourage some of these private providers of heat to invest in renewable and low carbon resources. Some of the other heat is provided by a city-owned CHP plant, which was also in the process of converting some of its generation to biomass. But they still had this Dong energy plant that was providing, it's a CHP plant, was providing heat, and again, that was derived from coal and oil. And so what the city did is it began working with Dong Energy and the national regulatory entity. So in Denmark, prices are regulated at the national level, and then the local entities have a little bit more control over what the particular investments are going to be made and sort of how those are going to be staged. And so essentially, Aarhus, the district heating system operates as kind of a quasi-city agency. It works very directly with the city planning entities, and so it's kind of, it represents the desires and the goals of the city pretty significantly. And so there is a national goal in Denmark to eliminate coal and oil within the district heating system by 2030. So that national goal provided this framework, and then the city kind of came up with its own approaches to doing that. So what it was trying to do is get Dong Energy to make the investments necessary to clean up some of the generation. And so what they did is they worked with the national regulator to say, okay, you, Dong Energy, we understand that in order to make upgrades to your boilers, in order to burn, in this case, straw, you're going to have to put some of your own capital into that. And obviously, you're not going to do that if there's too much risk. And so the district heating company itself, so representing the city essentially because they are a public entity, they put up some of the money for the conversion costs, and then Dong put up some of it with the recognition that they would be able to provide heat that could meet this long-term need. So they were kind of locking in their capability of being a desired provider of heat, and they knew that they would be able to continue their sort of long relationship providing heat to the system. The regulator had to approve this and had to approve a rate change that would reflect this and would enable rates to stay low while also returning enough of a return to Dong Energy to make it feasible and desirable. But in order to do that, the city had to go to the national regulator and make this case. And so this is an instance where, because the district heating company was essentially a public agency, it could represent sort of the entirety of the city needs at the national level, and to say, yes, we believe that this is the appropriate rate structure, and so it was a negotiation essentially back and forth until Dong had enough on the table that they were willing to make the investment. So that conversion is, I believe it actually was commissioned, I think maybe a month or so ago. I might be wrong about that. So that was kind of the financing arm of it that the position as the public entity allowed for. And again, because the city itself is very much directly involved in the structure and investment decision making of the district heating system, they can very directly integrate their own city goals for carbon reduction and for renewable energy. The city council, much like Vancouver and some other of the cases in this report, the city council is the one that has a lot of oversight over the investment decision making. And so if they perceive the benefits to be significant enough for their population, that's kind of the test that they're using. And again, this entire driver of carbon reduction was both the supranational at the EU and the national goals, national carbon pricing is embedded in decision making, and that trickles down to the city as well and these individual district heating companies. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that there's an established cost-benefit framework that is established at the national level. And so whenever any of these district heating companies or potential providers of heat into the system are considering investments, there's a clear delineation of exactly how you're going to value carbon and exactly how you're going to project the future costs of fuels. So there's not, that you can't have three different consultants come up with three entirely different assumptions. Everyone is working on the same assumptions, which makes the risk really, really low for the private sector because they understand exactly, what the assumptions are going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. This is a very dense slide with some of the strategies for success, but I think really in Aarhus, what they did is the city as leaders said, okay, we're going to sit down with the private sector and we're going to say, what do we need to do to de-risk this? And what do you need us to put on the table to feel like you can get in the game and you can provide the kind of resource that we need? Because I think in some cases, despite the fact that you have a public district heating company who might own some of the generation, there's still a recognition that in some cases the private sector can do things maybe faster and cheaper than you can, or in this case you had an existing generator that wanted to make some upgrades regardless. And so, understanding that there's this opportunity to leverage some of these private resources that you might be paying for as a public district heating company, I think was really critical. And they really, they made sure that all of their goals on CO2 were very well aligned and that they were all sort of trying to achieve the same thing. So this is just a last little, we like to talk about the journey of a lot of these systems. As Lakshmi mentioned, that a lot of them start off in different business models and they end up somewhere else entirely. In this case, the public model is what has really remained, but what has been different throughout the journey is this recognition that there are these private sector entities that can help meet their goals, and that if they, they don't have to build it all themselves. And so again, they do have some of their own generation, but they also, there's a lot of existing oil and coal powered generation in Denmark still. And there's a lot of, need to convert that to lower carbon resources. And so cities have to get creative with how they're going to help encourage that and make that happen. Ready to go to South Korea?
Yep.
Okay.
Today I talk about Sangam case again. First is the overview of the Sangam Integrated District Heating Plant, and the system at a glance. You can see that in the capacities, district heating is 278 megawatt hour, and district cooling is 180 megawatt hour, and the CHP can generate 4 megawatt electricity as well. And buildings, we served that 163 buildings, and this equipment contains the landfill gas and SRF boiler, and LNG peak load boiler and absorption chillers. We using a fuel in this plant as a SRF and the landfill gas and LNG either. Use the summer energy, space heating and cooling. So I will tell you first. I will talk about the financing issue. Please beware; it can be a little boring. So, yeah, so I can tell you that long-term contract with the Seoul Metropolitan Government enabled to KDHC to utilize the waste fuel and operate the waste-to-energy facilities. And Seoul drives the revenues of 5.5 million annually from the sale of waste fuels to the KDHC. And the government invested $38 million in this LFG project for pipelines to extract the landfill gas and building facilities to dispose of sewage sludge and rectate. KDHC invested $150 million for pipelines to connect the nearby CHP plant to get heat supply to Sangam and extend the Seoul Metropolitan District heating network. I believe you already seen the network in previous time, right? KDHC managing its project via debt and equity financing. Next, I will talk about governance of KDHC, not only Sangam case. KDHC was founded in 1985 as a public enterprise for promoting energy conservation and improving living standards through the efficient use of district heating. Korea government remains KDHC's largest shareholder with 34.6% ownership. Korea Electric Power Company, we call the KEPCO, holds 19.6%. And the other shareholders are government-owned Korea Energy Management Corporation, we call that KEMCO, and the Seoul Metropolitan Government, employees, and the general public. Shareholders can make revisions to the company's articles of incorporation, decide on the appointment of directors, and approve the settlement of accounts at the general shareholders meeting. This slide shows the strategies for success and the journey. We have been able to overcome problems by creating strategies for risk, information, money, and people. Through these strategies, we have successfully made the following journey, this kind of journey. This slide shows the location of Sangam in the Seoul metropolitan area. This part is the Sangam, Seoul metropolitan area, and in here is maybe Gangnam in Seoul, in here. And here is, actually we call the Jungang branch as a Sangam. Jungang branch including two facilities. One is the Sangam, the other one is just calling the Jungang. Yeah. And here, this marks means the booster station, is a pump, kind of pump, and this marks means the district, Korea District Heating Corporation, and here, here, and here. We have a CHP facility in here and CS facility in here, and you can, around here we have a big soccer playground. We call the Sangam, yeah. And Jungang branch is in here too, and this part is the other companies managing operating the CHP. And we have another booster station in here. Sangam branch is located in the closed landfill site. We call that Nanji landfill facility and supply the district heating and district cooling to consumers. When KDHC started this project, we did not do any special activities for residents around the Sangam plant, as you can see here. And there are no any residents around 3 kilometers. So not much activities for them. But after that, the new town was constructing in here, including IT industrial complex. So they have some trouble between us in the Sangam branch. This slide shows the landfill and facilities bird's eye view in here. As I told you, we the Korea government built 2 park on the landfill site. Here is a North Park, and here is a Haner Park. We just call it say that. And landfill gas extraction hose was installed at the beginning stage for supplying landfill gas to KDHC Sangam branch. 58 holes in the North Park and 48 holes in the Haner Parks in here. Actually, Sangam branch is a part of the Jungang branch, as I told you. So I will show you current status of Jungang branch. Sangam has this kind of DH equipment in here. Those are district cooling equipments and other in Jungang branches. This slide shows the customer status of Jungang branch as well. And we have a district heating service and district cooling service as well. Total supply capacity is this. Actually, Jungang branch supplies district heating and cooling to multiple users at once, collecting house, building, and the other locations. This slide shows the Jungang branch configurations. So Jungang branch has LFG boilers and heat exchangers for incinerator steam and biogas engine. In here is biogas engine and incinerator in here. Jungang branch operates the many boilers and gas engine. These facility burning the LNG as well, waste and biogas provides heat to our consumers and other locations. This slide shows the district cooling entire diagram of the Jungang branch, and we have much different kind of chillers, absorption chillers, turbo chillers, and brain hill chillers, and we have an ice storage tank inside of the Jungang branch. And we, for operating the absorption chiller, we using a boiler and incinerator as well. Jungang branch operates the many chillers, and you can see that. And absorption chillers make a cold water by using steam or hot water. Yeah, this slide shows the biogas harvesting process diagram. And okay, then biogas combined heat and power plant is like this. And this plant using biogas make heat and electricity generated in the process of wastewater disposal. And facility using a gas engine, 2 gas engines, and gas cleaner system. They has a gas cleanup system and heat exchanger either too. And the capacity is like this. Yeah, you can see in this slide the LFG harvesting diagrams, and in here is landfill gas and collection well in here, and using a pipeline, we scrubbers. It's 2 scrubbers we inside the plant, and then we sending a landfill gas to the gas boiler. This is the incinerator system diagrams. We can make heat by this process. And this is my lesson learned. The Integrated Energy Supply Act provide valuable information on designated planned DH supply zone. The risks customer connection are certain things and helps with the longer-term planning of DH companies. And South Korea, RPS enabled to use of local resources to reduce waste. And leveraging LFG resource in Sangam helps meet environmental goals. The long-term contract with the Seoul Metropolitan Government enabled KDHC to utilize waste fuel and operate waste-to-energy facilities. Use of CHP to meet heating and electricity needs was made possible by public sector energy efficiency and electricity supply partners, KEPCO and CHEMCO. This is my final slide, and thanks to attention to my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be fairly brief with this one, but it's actually titled Private Business Model, but the interesting thing about this one, and I think Lashmi explained it in a previous slide, it's actually kind of migrated through a number of business models. So the first thing to say is that for people in the UK, WIC is a long, long way away. I know in North America you used great distances, but this is about 1,000 miles away from London, and it is very, very remote as far as we're concerned. It doesn't actually have a part of the national gas network, but it does have a gas network which actually relies on LPG that's actually trucked in and then kind of fed into a local network. Otherwise, people actually have solid fuel, electric, and also oil for their kind of their heating. It's also got a very famous distillery there, whiskey distillery, Pulteney Town, which is a very, very kind of fine whiskey. I recommend that you try it sometime. It was originally set up, no, unfortunately I didn't. I think I would have actually had to brought a whole case to get around the whole room, so fortunately I didn't. But Inverhouse was a number of distilleries. It went through an MBO, and it's now actually owned by a Thai drinks company. So quite interesting. Not going to go through the details of this, but you can see it's kind of quite small, 3.5 megawatt, and that is a heat-only boiler, 10-kilometer network, 270 residential units connected, public buildings. The whiskey, Lashmi, you've kind of misspelt whiskey. A Scottish whiskey, only it doesn't have any in it. And oh, did it? Oh, right. Okay. My fault then. Fuel is biomass, and the local authority, the municipality, had actually done a lot of kind of mapping of where the biomass resource was in the locality, as well as kind of heat mapping, load mapping in the town to kind of know where it was. But to describe it is that the thing was established around about 2002 as a community-owned entity. Caithness Eaton Power, CHAP was the acronym, and it was the municipality, the distillery, housing association, a local people's project and what have you. And it was taking waste heat baseload from the distillery for these 243 homes, which were adjacent to the distillery, with actually a kind of a backup biomass boiler to provide peak load. That was actually financed by a central government program at the time, 1.4 mil, with a matching element coming from the local municipality's fuel poverty program. Now, when this project started to go wrong, is that their technical advisor, their consultant, suggested that they actually get in a biomass, a gasified biomass CHP unit. And this thing, they got a grant from the Community Energy program to finance that. It was innovative. It wasn't bankable, as we would say, with a proven track record. And the blade on the gasifier wasn't never kind of worked successfully. But the motivation was that the government has a program to subsidize renewably produced electricity. So it's hoping to kind of capture this additional kind of a revenue to bring it into the project. Well, it never really worked, and so consequently the thing was running on heavy fuel oil. It wasn't getting like the renewable incentives. It was costing them more. It was dirty, and the whole thing wasn't kind of working. So consequently is that the municipality had to step in and buy the thing out in order to save the project. And they tried to make it run over a number of years and invested some 11.5 million in just keeping the whole thing afloat. But at the end of that, they decided that they were going to try and involve a third party to come in on a concession basis. And one of the people that expressed an interest in it was Ignis Energy. In fact, nobody could make this stack up. And so the municipality decided that they were going to abandon the project and auction off the assets. And Ignis Energy raised 3 million private equity capital from the City of London and bought the assets. Now, it's very important that because what he was able to do by doing that, Craig Ibbetson's the principal of Ignis Energy, he was able to shed the debt that this kind of project was carrying. Having done that is that he kind of reverted to a heat-only boiler. He did not buy the kind of the CHP unit. He secured a steam contract with a distillery, so rather than taking the heat from the distillery, he was selling it into the distillery. The residents, they were given the choice whether they actually wanted to stay on the network or whether they actually wanted to go back to the previous electricity heated thing, and 90% of them chose to remain on the network. The thing is that the alternative cost of energy up there is extremely high, so 90% of them remained on it. But previously it had been unmetered, so that they were paying a flat rate charge for their heat. They installed meters, prepayment meters, to actually secure the revenues. Expanded the network to non-residential loads, the local assembly rooms and other public facilities in the town, and that actually kind of helped the diversity of load, so had a more stable load. Now, for a long time, is that he was negotiating with a regional hospital in the area to try and sign them up, because they were the key anchor load for this project. And the guy at the hospital, his pen hovered over the contract for about 6 months before he actually signed the thing, even though it would actually save him money. And in a way, you can understand it because of the difficult history that the project had gone through. He didn't know that he was signing up to a kind of a dud project. But in the end, he signed it, and within a matter of months is that Ignis Energy flipped the thing, refinanced it, sold it to 100% sale to a green investment bank and Equitex. And so this kind of private capital came in and bought it out because it had been de-risked. So, and they actually subcontracted out the O&M and development to 2 separate companies. So it actually, it started out as governance, as a municipality, established as a municipality, community-owned entity. So there were all these members, and each one had a representation on the board. When it was bought out by the municipality, is that the board was consisted of 6 local councillors. Now, this was actually reviewed by Audit Scotland about this 11.5 million of lost public money, and these people were censored for their kind of lack of commercial nous in running this project. But once it was kind of purchased by Ignis, it became wholly privately owned, and so therefore it was controlled by this chap, Craig Ibbotson, and then sold on total share ownership to the Green Investment Bank and Equitex. So in terms of strategies for success is that use technologies with a proven track record. That means it's actually like having 3 reference sites with 10 years worth of data. With that is bankable. People will invest in that. Below that, you're taking a risk. Reduce the bad debt risk with prepayment meters I mentioned. Reducing seasonal heat demand by kind of, with an industrial connection, you get that kind of diversity. Getting that kind of anchor load to sign, the hospital actually like gave the investors of the Green Investment Bank and Equitex confidence that the thing was going to be there for the long term. And larger scale deliveries, greater revenues, but need to develop demand. In fact, this is a quote directly from Craig himself, but I think what he means there is that smaller projects tend to have a higher IRR, but once they're expanded and kind of built out, a lower kind of IRR, but once they're kind of built out, it goes up, and so the whole thing becomes much more profitable. But of course, that means you actually have to invest in the development to develop that demand. So initial studies I mentioned, mission development work, heat and resource mapping was supported by the municipality, who also undertook the feasibility study, and developers, I don't think that should be there actually. So in terms of financing, it was a mixture of grants, public subsidy. Interestingly, the equity investor, Ludgate Capital, had confidence in this chap's ability to actually kind of make the project work, and so consequently was willing to take that in development risk because they had confidence in his business plan. The institutional investors, on the other hand, didn't want to take that development risk, but once the project had been de-risked, is that therefore they were prepared to kind of take it on. Larger scale CHP brings in kind of great benefits in terms of the revenues, but make sure that it is a proven technology, and it does actually kind of require larger investment to get that return. Key thing is, and it kind of reflects back to what Lashmi was saying in the introduction, is that having a kind of focused management and a kind of ring-fence budget helps these kind of projects, but also having clear goals and objectives right from the outset. And the objectives for this thing have actually kind of been maintained throughout the life of the different business models that have been taken. So in summary is that mission and vision underpinned by early mapping and technical studies is that was retained throughout the process, during which the project was reconfigured, management replaced, and risk transfer to the equity investor. But once that actually had been developed, is that the institutional investors were happy to take it on. Thank you very much. Yeah. Somebody else.
Yeah, I've got one for Michael. I think one of your slides here was talking about, early in the history the company was formed. Now, before that, there had to be a lot of work done to prepare a vision, get different counterparties involved, and take it to that step where the entity was actually formed. Can you talk a little bit about that very early stage and when timing is appropriate to actually form an entity and move things forward from there? It's kind of the earliest phase of the journey once you have a concept in mind and you're trying to get it to the point that it's an enterprise.
Thanks, Eric, as that I can always rely on you to kind of ask me the tough questions. I think there was in many kind of projects, there is the presence of what you'd call a champion, somebody who is going to be that awkward individual and move things along. And Wick was quite fortunate is that there was a fairly senior energy professional who worked for the IEA, International Energy Agency in Paris, but actually came from Wick. And on her retirement from her career, she kind of moved back to Wick. And so she was one of the kind of critical factors. The other thing is this presence of this community energy program money, is that it was actually supporting a certain amount of development work. So, it was bringing together this kind of champion and the kind of opportunity of being able to get, they were offering up to 40% grants as well as kind of 50% for development work. So bringing the two together was what really kind of made it happen.
And was that early investment then monetized somehow when they formed the company?
No. It was sunk. I think it was like, in a way referring to, I think it was Bruce, I'm not quite sure it was in the presentation or whilst I was talking to him over coffee, is that the municipalities sort of see it as the broader objectives of reducing carbon emissions, improving resilience, improving affordability, things of that nature. That was really what it was, and consequently is that they were able to match the community energy program contribution from their kind of fuel poverty fund. This money was going to be spent on some sort of initiative to deal with fuel poverty, and it was invested in this particular project.